This is Conversations in Civics. I'm Dr. Terry Susan Fine. Joining me for this conversation is John Watson, the Social Studies Subject Area Leader for Mulrennan Middle School. John, tell me a little bit about what it means to be a Social Studies Subject Area Leader.
Well, thank you, Dr. Fine. Actually, I enjoy it quite immensely. Not only am I able to educate students as a teacher, but also I'm able to help develop teachers and help them become better educators. So I find the job to be quite rewarding.
So you get to work with students and teachers.
Yes.
Thanks so much. Today we're going to do a little discussion about a lot of different documents, but all that these documents have in common is they each impacted the colonists' views of the government and ultimately led to the writing of the Declaration of Independence. John, I'm sure you have some questions for me. What's your first one?
Okay. My first question is, government has a role to take care of its people and to protect its people, and the English did its part in helping fight the French and Indian War, which led to some of the taxes and the other things that the English put forth on the colonists. Mm-hmm. Well, so do you feel the English were justified in some of the things they did which led to the Declaration of Independence?
You know, that's a great question because it really talks about the relationship between the people and their government. And what it tells us is that there were some disagreements about the nature of that relationship. And you talked about taxes, for example. How do taxes fit into that relationship? Well, in many respects, people expect that if they're going to be paying taxes, that they're going to be protected in response to that, right? That's the exchange of that. So I think that when we look at what the colonists' expectations were, they were being taxed in ways that they felt were not getting them back what they wanted in that relationship. So for example, we talk about the tea tax or the stamp tax. And these were taxes that were put on the colonists that the colonists believed were taking away their quality of life. I mean, did you know, John, that the stamp tax included newspapers and even dice that you could play games with?
No.
And consequently, people thought, well, it's hard to conduct business and it's hard for everybody to read a newspaper if we have to pay extra because of these stamps, for example.
And that makes perfect sense. So it affected every part of their life, every aspect of their life from day to day, what they're doing and so forth. Do you feel that when the government starts doing that, starts putting itself in people's day-to-day life, that leads to problems and complaints from the citizens?
Well, we know that government is part of our day-to-day life. It's whether or not the way that the relationship works we find is appropriate. It's not whether or not we're going to have government in our day-to-day lives. It's what form that's going to take.
Right.
So ultimately we find that the colonists believed that it was unreasonable for the king to be imposing certain taxes on them because they weren't experiencing the benefit of those taxes in terms of the kinds of protections that government could bring for them. Right? And we also see that there were so many documents that were written that really talked about that relationship, that there was the English Bill of Rights, there was the Magna Carta, there was the, Thomas Paine even in 1776 published this brochure that talked about the relationship between the people and the government, and he really said the relationship wasn't working between the colonists and the king, and he advocated for a revolution. Now, you told me earlier, I think, that you had a question about revolution. What was that?
Yeah, it's with all of the complaints and the concerns, could it have been possible that the revolution would have not taken place, or was it just inevitable that you're going to have a revolution?
You know, that's a great question because it really gets to what we eventually will find in the Declaration, which is it the people involved in the governance process, and maybe they have certain ideas about, for example, should people be loyal to one another for the sake of the greater good? Right? Wasn't that something that was talked about in the Mayflower Compact? Right? That we're going to be joined together for the sake of the greater good. Right. Or is it instead that people are going to realize your sense of the greater good and my sense of the greater good are not the same, and because they're not the same, we have to break it off, right? So it's interesting because later on in the Declaration, it talks about the form of government and whether or not the people involved in governance were the right people. And so basically, the colonists were concerned that with a unitary form of government, and a unitary government means that there is the judiciary power, the executive power, and the legislative power are all in one place, right? So when we think of the word uni or unique or even unicycle, it all means one.
Right.
So government is in one place. And, so was a revolution inevitable? Well, some would say it was inevitable because the people involved had a different sense about what was the greater good.
Right. Okay, and that makes perfect sense too. And you speaking about uni, when it comes to types of governments, do you feel that the type of government can't help but lend itself towards whether someone is being oppressed or have freedoms? I mean, can you have freedoms under a unit government, something that is just by one person?
John, that's a great question because, you're asking, does it matter if it's a unitary government or a federal government or a confederal government as to whether or not the people will have their rights guaranteed? And in many respects, it has a lot to do with the foundations of that government. So when you look at documents such as the English Bill of Rights or you look at the Magna Carta, those documents did say that the people had rights.
Right.
Even though the government of the day, when those documents were written, was a unitary government. So that has a lot to do with who's governing and what their values are.
Right.
And are they a benevolent leader, or are they instead someone who believes that the people are their subjects, and therefore there are not certain rights that need to be protected? It's interesting because once you do protect the rights of the people, no matter the form of government, that government earns a lot of trust. Right? And so it seems that the colonists just didn't trust the government to do the right thing. And so in many ways, revolution was inevitable.
And that makes perfect sense too. So when we look at the actual complaints laid forth, do you think that there was some justification for some of those complaints and so forth?
Absolutely. We talked about taxes a few minutes ago, John. And when we look at taxes, people recognize that taxes are inevitable.
Right.
But what isn't inevitable is who is taxed, how they are taxed, and the process by which those taxes were imposed. Right. And so we have to understand that the colonists were not complaining about there being taxes. The colonists were complaining about who was being taxed, how they were being taxed, and the process. Remember that quote from Patrick Henry, right? That, no taxation without representation. It didn't say no taxation. It said no taxation without representation. And so consequently, the colonists didn't have a voice in making the decisions about taxes.
Okay, so then maybe I'll go back to this point, I'll just beat it to death. If the king maybe had, for instance, given them a voice in Parliament, had given them a chance to have representation, could that have mitigated some of the issues that they had and therefore maybe put off or even avoided revolution altogether?
Absolutely, and you know why? Because even in every system, no matter what the system of government, no matter what the culture, no matter what the country, no matter how long that country's been in existence, there's never going to be 100% of the people agreeing 100% of the time.
Right.
So how do you avoid dissension? How do you avoid the ultimate dissension, which is revolution? You avoid it by respecting the people's rights and respecting the minority's right to have a viewpoint and to express it. And that's where King George III made a mistake. The mistake he made was not in taxing, but in taxing without giving the colonists, which were a minority voice, without giving them a voice in the process. Because what we find is even psychologically, even if a decision is made that we disagree with, as long as we could be a part of that discussion, people usually will go along with that discussion. And that wasn't going on with the colonists in the 1770s. It just wasn't happening.
And that makes perfect sense. And even within the colonists themselves, you have the leaders, you have the rich, and you have those who are less rich and so forth and poor. Was everyone within the colony, along the colonists, were they all their expressions being met? I mean, were the rich and the poor, were they equally being represented?
No, and the reason is that it's all about those taxes and those policies. Because indeed, what happens is when you're dealing with the poor and you're dealing with people who have agrarian interests versus business interests, you're dealing with poor versus wealthy, they're going to be affected differently by different taxes. So for example, we talk about the stamp tax. if the stamp tax required that on a contract you had to have a stamp and you had to pay for the stamp, then that's going to affect what you could charge for anything involved with the contract, such as property. Right. So if you are selling someone property, and in selling someone property that you have to pay more to process that transaction, you might end up charging more for that property. Well, someone who owns no property isn't going to be so concerned about that. And it's interesting because later on, even though we're not talking about him today, but I'm going to bring it up anyway, John Locke, when he wrote the Second Treatise of Civil Government, John Locke said that the government should protect life, liberty, and property. Well, when Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, he wrote that the government should protect life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Then why make a change? Well, of course, there's some debate about the change, but one of them, of course, is because the colonists couldn't agree on the slavery question. Right. And the other argument is some people say that Thomas Jefferson was worried that people who didn't own property wouldn't support the revolution, right? If you say if government's supposed to protect life, liberty, and property, and I have no property, why should I get on board? Right. So even sort of what eventually came to be, which was not only a revolution for independence, but a written declaration of independence, that even there was that recognition that there were diverse points of view in terms of the relationship between the government and people, because there was diversity in terms of people's economic circumstances. So indeed, the rich and the poor had different views about the role of government in their lives.
That's awesome. And we see that laid out when it comes to how we put our government together and so forth, and those different agreements and so forth that we have. And even the documents like the Magna Carta, you have it is working together for everyone, despite where they're coming from and so forth. And that's pretty good. It's pretty good.
Right, and that's the notion that people have basic rights, which we find in the English Bill of Rights, that people have basic rights. But at the same time, this idea about a common connection, this viewpoint that everybody comes together for the greater good, right, is written in the Mayflower Compact. I mean, the Mayflower Compact is about a paragraph, right? Mm-hmm. It's not that long, right, but it's what it says that makes it so important. It's the idea about the people giving to each other, right, their shared destiny. Mm-hmm. The idea that everybody has a shared vision and a shared destiny, and everyone then is important in the process of the country, such as it was, moving forward.
Right. And so because everyone's important, everyone has a voice to some degree, whether it's a minority voice, at least it gives you some buy-in, mm-hmm, and you can be a strong stakeholder, and you're willing to do what you need to do to help it succeed.
Right. At least you believe that you were heard, right, and that your voice and your place in that society really had value.
Right. And that makes sense.
Now, I was wondering, John, we know that the colonists first, came to what we now know as the United States in around 1607, right? And yet it wasn't until 1776 that they just said enough was enough. And many people argue that it wasn't that the kings themselves were not benevolent. It's that King George III particularly, he was just a real difficult king, right? And so I'm wondering, do your students sort of wonder about that? Like, why did it take over 170 years to declare independence? Do they think about it in terms of sort of who was in charge? Do they think about it in terms of other factors?
They generally don't focus upon who was in charge. Mm-hmm. They only look at it from the colonist perspective, yeah, and how they look at all the different things that was placed upon the colonists. And then they say, well, I can see all the suffering they were going through. Mm-hmm. We did an activity in which the students actually created some protests and signs and stuff forth like that to protest what was happening, as though they were the colonists. And I think that was the major focus that they look at, not just from the government's perspective, but just from the colonist perspective, that, hey, we're suffering, we're having these problems, we're having these issues, and therefore I'm going to speak my mind. Mm-hmm. When you put it in the students' day-to-day life, like cell phones in school and dress code and things like that, they really internalize it. Mm-hmm. So I guess it's just this desire to want to have freedoms and liberties that each of us have. And so they tend to focus upon those liberties and freedoms and so forth, as opposed to the oppressive regime, if you will, mm-hmm, of the school or of the government,
John, I so appreciate that you brought this discussion up to date, and I wish that we had more time to talk today. It's been a wonderful conversation.
Yes.
We've been talking about how various documents, including the Magna Carta, the English Bill of Rights, the Mayflower Compact, and even Thomas Paine's Common Sense, impacted the colonists' view of government. That's Conversations in Civics. I'm Dr. Terry Susan Fine.